Welcome to the Business Talk, a global podcast series that highlights distinguished faculty members and their impactful scholarly contributions. I'm Deepak, your host from India. We are honored to welcome Dr. Simon Kirchin as our distinguished guest on Business Talk today. Before we get started, I would like to introduce today's guest. Dr. Simon Kirchin serves as the director of the Idea Center at the University of Leeds, where he champions the integration of ethics across disciplines alongside his role as a deputy head of the school. Prior to joining Leeds, he spent many years at the University of Kent, including nearly a decade as a Dean, Executive Dean. He is also director of the British Philosophical Association, the UK's principal body for philosophers, where he works closely with exam boards to support and shape philosophy and religious studies education. Committed to bringing philosophy into the public sphere, he hosts two podcasts, Philosophy Takes on the News and Philosophy Gets Story. His research spans applied ethics, metaethics, normative ethics, aesthetics, and epistemology, with current projects exploring normativity, imitation, leadership, trust in science, and ethics of performance. An experienced PhD supervisor, he welcomes research across diverse areas, including disagreement, transhumanism, virtues theory, and moral psychology. He teaches widely across the university, including leadership ethics, AI ethics, risk, and the ethics of mental health. In today's episode, Dr. Simon Kirchin joins us to unpack the central ideas from his book, The Future of Normativity. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Simon Kirchin to the conversation. Professor Simon, it's a distinct privilege to welcome you to Business Talk. We are grateful to you for accepting our invitation.
Thanks for inviting me on, Deepak. It's lovely to meet you and to be on here.
Thank you. Professor, could you help our listeners understand what philosophers mean by normativity and why it's such an important concept in philosophy? Also, how does this idea connect to real-world fields like business and business studies?
Sure, thanks. Yes, so this is going to be quite an abstract kind of topic and perhaps not something that many of your listeners or viewers will immediately understand with normativity. But in fact, normative talk and normative thinking is all around us all the time. So often we're used to going around the world and saying things like, I'm listening to a podcast, today is Wednesday, today is Thursday. The temperature is thus and so, the weather will probably be raining later on, kind of everyday stuff. But we also say things like, it ought to rain tomorrow, or I hope it rains tomorrow, or I ought to listen to that podcast, or that podcast was really good, or things of that nature. We'll come up with lots more examples as well. And when we're talking about certain sorts of oughts and reasons we might perform actions and standards and norms that there might be, such as how we should act in polite society. And when we think about the value of acting in certain ways or the value of a podcast, we're engaging in normative talk and thought. So normativity, as I say, is all around us. We're thinking about it all the time. Just to unpack just a little bit more. So sometimes when we say it ought to rain, right? Sometimes it might be an expression of a normative idea. It might not be. So sometimes we say, I've seen the weather forecast. I've looked at the sky. I've talked to people. Given all of that, I'm predicting that it will rain. That's not what we mean by normativity and a normative ought. Rather, normativity and oughts are things that morally you ought to do, or things that you ought to do because it would be great if you produced that work of art or something like that. So it's really things connected with values. And again, there'll be lots of examples. So for people who are used to thinking about this in business studies, social sciences, they actually might use the word normative and normativity quite a bit. So often there's a distinction in philosophy and in other academic disciplines between the descriptive and the normative, or the positive and the normative, or the positive and the evaluative, between how things are and how we think ought to be, and what the value is of them being that way. And so people in business, people in politics, people every day will be thinking in these terms. This is how things are, but what should we do and what will be the value of it? And why philosophers are interested in that is it's a big overarching way of thinking, but there's loads of things going on, lots of questions we can ask. First of all, what's the difference between all these different concepts, such as reason and ought and should and norms and standards and values? And then they might be thinking, well, is any of this normative talk authoritative? Right? You say I ought to produce that work of art, but who says? What authority do you have? People say I ought to do this because it would be good for the business. Well, who says so? Well, perhaps they're the boss. Who made you the boss? That sort of stuff. So there's lots, and there's lots more we'll come on to with your questions, I'm sure. But there's lots of things philosophers are going to be thinking about analysing normative thought and talk, and arguing for particular views about it, and thinking creatively and imaginatively about what's really going on in everyday normative thinking.
Professor, the book asks what the future of normative thought could and should be. If you had to pick one trend that will define the next decade of work on normativity, what would it be and why?
So one trend, I think there's quite a few. Let me pick out two, and I think we might come back to them a little bit more. So one would be that question of authority. So it's just a really, really big question, which pops up in lots of different ways in academic philosophy and indeed in other academic disciplines and in everyday life, right? Philosophy might seem as if it's an abstract thing. Actually, philosophers are quite practically minded, and they're really kind of thinking about what we're doing as everyday people. So lots of people think about authority. So you say this, who made you boss? We think that things are morally right or wrong. Well, who says so? Is it just me or our society? Or is there a god or gods or some other religious or supernatural body that's really fundamentally behind and giving us the authority to say things are morally right or wrong? So I think the authority of normativity is something that people have thought about and will carry on thinking about. Then there's another topic. So I've mentioned all of these different normative concepts that lots of philosophers think about and have been thinking about for the last 10 or 15 years quite intensely. Reasons and oughts and shoulds and norms and values. And what's happened, I think, over the last 10 or 15 years is that many people have said that in order to really understand normativity, we have to think hard about all of these concepts and actually think of one of them as more fundamental than the other. So philosophers like analysing concepts and ideas. And often people will say one of these is fundamentally the key to understanding what normativity is. Many people think it's reasons, for example. And I'm in the minority where I think that's a crazy idea. I don't think any of these concepts is normative. And there's been one or two papers about this, but I think that's probably something that will run and run for the next 10 years. Those are two. I've got others as well, but those are two ideas.
Professor, many of the essays examine core notions like reasons, value, and obligation, and how they relate to one another. Do you think one of these concepts is more fundamental than the others? Or is that the wrong way to think about normativity?
Yeah, good. So yeah, this carries straight on from my answer I've just given. So just in case your listeners and viewers don't know, so it's my book. It's an edited collection. So I've got a paper in there and a large introduction explaining all this stuff. But there's lots of other papers in there, and quite a few papers in the collection talk about this. I do as well. So I don't think that obligation, oughts, shoulds, duties, reasons, values, norms, standards, all of these are very important normative concepts. So unlike many people, I don't think that one of them is more fundamental than the other. So my view is that they all perform very important roles in our normative architecture, so how we might think of things. So let's say, what ought I to do? Perhaps what ought I to do overall? And you think about what you should do. So it may be a moral issue, it may be an issue about what you should believe. And often there'll be reasons that you will be able to cite about what you should do or shouldn't do and what you should believe or not believe. And the reasons are like the little building blocks, and then the oughts or the shoulds are the overall judgment. And similarly, you can say, if you end up doing that, it would be a valuable situation, and perhaps valuable because it would be kind, or because it would generate lots of understanding, or whatever it might be. And then also there might be norms. If you believe in this way, you'd be conforming to the norm, you'd be adhering to the norm, which we think is significant and has a certain sort of authority. All of these concepts and more are interesting building blocks in our normative architecture. Many philosophers will take them all and then say, yes, but reason or ought is the fundamental one. You can analyze all the others in terms of that one. Actually, I think you can, but I think you can play that move for all of them, right? So all of them can be interdefined. I don't think any of them is more fundamental. There's a really interesting paper by a philosopher called Daniel Wodek who talks about this issue. One of the very few philosophers who also is someone who doesn't think that only one of these concepts is the most foundational. And he talks about philosophy of mind. So philosophers think a lot about mind and consciousness, have been for decades, or indeed centuries. And Daniel says, well, when we understand consciousness or just human mental activity, there's all sorts of mental states, as philosophers and others talk about them. There's beliefs and other sorts of representation, right? So cognizing the world, what it looks like, how it feels like, how it sounds like. Then there's desires and wishes and hopes and intentions. There's emotions and moods and other things as well. If we want to understand human mental activity, we don't think of one of these as the most important. All of them are important. They just play different roles. And that's his view and my view about normativity. But that's a minority view. There are quite a few clever arguments that say these analyses work. I don't believe them. Okay.
Professor, a recurring question in the volume is whether there is a unity of normativity across ethics, aesthetics, and epistemology. After editing or engaging with this collection, are you more optimistic or more skeptical about such unity?
So I'm definitely optimistic. And I think it's probably fair to say most people are optimistic. So often in philosophy, we'll think about areas of human activity and thought in terms of domains. The domain of ethics or morality, so what we should do, how we should act, how we should treat other people. The area of aesthetics, philosophy of art, so creating and judging things to be beautiful or ugly or whatever else. Epistemology, what you should believe, how you should understand. And there's other domains as well we might be interested in. And across all three of those domains, there's lots of normative talk about what we ought to believe, what we ought to create, the value of treating people in a certain way, and so on. And I think most philosophers have a working assumption that the idea of a reason, of an ought, of a value is going to have to be stable across them all, because we talk as if they are, and we need to. Often there's situations where there's ethical and aesthetic crossover, and what we believe has moral implications, and vice versa. So it better be the case that reason and ought and value have the same general meanings in these different domains. So I think most people are optimistic about it, and I am. The issue comes, I suppose, is quite a local philosophical issue, that when philosophers are talking about normative notions, they often might couch these things in different ways. So there's a paper in the volume by another Daniel Whiting, who talks about the unity across these three domains, and notes that when people are talking about reasons and what we ought to do in epistemology, they're typically putting it in modal terms. So modal here means talk about possibility and necessity and what it's like in this world compared with nearby hypothetical possible worlds. So are things necessary across this world and other worlds, or are they possible, i.e. they exist in this world but don't exist in that nearby other world? Whereas that sort of talk isn't apparent in aesthetics and ethics very much. And so he's trying to do a kind of crossover, trying to do a kind of translation study, that whether normative talk is defended in modal terms actually makes sense in the ethics domain and aesthetics domain. So in a way, there's a lot of unpacking of that to do, but I think many people will assume that there is a unity of normativity. But we'll see. 5 years' time, someone might write a fantastic paper showing that there isn't, and that will be interesting.
Professor, the introduction talks about stepping back and reflecting on familiar debates to open up new directions for research. Can you give us an example where reframing an old question about normativity lead to genuinely new line of inquiry?
Yeah, so I think kind of probably my favorite example of that is in aesthetics and philosophy of art. So perhaps I'll do a little bit of an introduction to that. So I think we're going to talk about metaethics soon. So let me talk about metaethics. So metaethics is a well-established area of philosophy, and certainly over the last 50 years has been very kind of well-trodden ground and has lots of centuries in the Western tradition and other traditions, philosophical traditions as well, about thinking. What's metaethics? Metaethics is basically concerned with not what it is, well, not which actions are right and wrong in defending them and justifying them. Rather, it's thinking about what rightness and wrongness are in the first place, and thinking about whether there really are good and bad and right and wrong moral properties that exist in the world that we're picking out and judging, or whether it's some form of human imposition onto the world. And if so, what's going on with language? And if there is a kind of moral reality out there in the world, how it relates to modern science. So do you want to be a naturalist and try and reduce or understand moral reality in certain terms, in natural terms, terms that scientists might recognize? Or are you a non-naturalist and think that moral talk is of its own kind? There is a moral reality, but you can't reduce it. You can't understand it in scientific terms. That was very broad, very quick. That's basically metaethics, well-trodden ground. And so there's still some great stuff that comes out in metaethics, but a lot of the energy has gone into normativity over the last 10 years, partly because so much ground in metaethics is well-trodden. And I think what's interesting about moving to thinking about normativity is you can see in aesthetics. Remember, I talked about metaethics, and the emphasis there is very much on judging things to be right and wrong and how we should act. But for some reason in aesthetics, there's always been a prejudice, an emphasis on judging works of art rather than what we have to do as creators of works of art. Don't know why, it's just a happenstance. But then moving to normativity with such an emphasis on reasons to act and what we ought to do, then I think by coincidence or anything else, then I think there's more attention now paid in aesthetics and indeed in wider metaethical thinking to what the possibilities of there being aesthetic reasons and aesthetic oughts. Some people talk about this in the volume. And I think that's a kind of interesting example where it's not as if there's a new argument or a new kind of particular point that's unlocked something, but just a movement, just in the sort of language and concepts that people are using where some possibility comes in more into view, namely the idea of aesthetic reasons and aesthetic oughts. And that's an interesting topic.
Professor, some chapters explore how different domains, moral, epistemic, and aesthetic norms claim different kinds of degree of authority over us. What do you think really explain why some norms feel binding in a way others do not?
Good. So yeah, this returns back to one of my earlier answers, doesn't it? I don't think I've got a really good answer here. So I think the secret of authority is something that many people have been searching for in philosophy. And obviously there's some straightforward answers. So an answer I gave a little while ago, some people might believe in God or a gods or some supernatural entity. So something outside of humans and human agency. And so when we say this thing is authoritative, this thing is right, this thing is wrong, the authority is something supernatural. And that's a perfectly cogent position and obviously has much written and thought about it through the centuries in different cultures. I think if you aren't going to go down a supernatural or religious route, then you might then have to come up with something a bit more complex about society. So when we say that something is morally right or wrong, it's going to be a complicated story about human biology, somehow reacting in certain ways to pain and pleasure. It's going to get more complicated. There are different ways in which we react to pain and pleasure, just as humans, and there are different sorts of pleasures and pains and actions, right? And then across the society, people are going to have lots of different views. I mean, you can get reflective. So you can build up a very complex picture, but it might be something rooted in human society and human biology that comes together. And it's never going to be clear cut. The supernatural story, you can say, however we can know things, it's clear cut. God says this in certain religious traditions. The position I've just sketched about human biology, human sociology, or society is not going to be clear cut. But for many people, that's where they'd want to kind of situate themselves, as that's where authority is. But that authority can always be challenged. So I don't think there's going to be any big, obvious, uncontroversial explanation here about where authority comes from and why it differs in different domains. But that's probably where you'd start. I think when it comes to different domains, ethics, it often feels as if ethics should trump aesthetics, or many ethics considerations trump many aesthetic considerations, possibly because the stakes are a bit higher. You're dealing with human lives and human pain and pleasure, whereas in aesthetics, often you're not. But some people feel aesthetic issues very deeply, and they might be more important than ethical issues. So.
Because the volume is deliberately positioned beyond traditional metaethics in some respects. What does going beyond metaethics actually look like in practice? And does it risk losing the clarity that meta-ethical debates have built up?
Yeah, good. So this comes back to the metaethics issue. So I certainly think to answer the last point first, it certainly risks losing the clarity that it has in metaethics. So let me talk just about that first of all. So in metaethics, I don't know how much your listeners and viewers will be familiar with it, but let me just name a few positions, just going on from what I was saying earlier on. So you've got a whole family of moral realist positions, which basically say there is a moral reality. When you and I are judging and discussing or debating whether something's right or wrong, good or bad, there's going to be an answer. And the answer is going to be given by reality. Just as we might say, does Saturn exist, or is Saturn such and such a size? There's an actually definitive answer, no matter what you and I say. But then there's an interesting issue if you're a moral realist. Are you a naturalist and you think that moral stuff like goodness or kindness can be reduced to scientific concepts and terms, or phenomena that scientists can study? And then there's different versions of that. Or you're going to be a non-naturalist and think that moral stuff can't be reduced in that way. Then you've got different non-realist positions. Some, which has a lot to do with philosophy of language, which is going to get a bit technical. But this is well-trodden ground. So well-trodden, it's not just something that's studied at universities, but certainly in the United Kingdom. Lots of kids study this at high school in certain A-levels, in philosophy and religious studies A-levels. And so there's a certain clarity there of these different positions and all the various arguments and moves that have been built up across centuries, and particularly across the last 50 years. But what some people might describe as clarity, some people might describe as kind of cemented stuff. So there's still, I've used the phrase well-trodden as well. There's still interesting material that comes out about metaethics. But, say 30, 40 years ago, it was really lively, new arguments, new big positions. I did metaethics in my PhD at the University of Sheffield. But there's not those really big positions coming out now. So what you get by transferring a lot of that energy to normativity and getting some of those same ideas transferred in different questions around reasons and oughts and values. What's the relationship between reasons and values? Normative, a kind of narrowly normative idea, an evaluative term. You're getting similar things going on, but there's a different set of questions. And so it's not clear yet, because we're still in a kind of vanguard area of the last 15, 20 years. It'll take quite a while to move into a kind of distinct, clear positions. But in a way, that's what makes philosophy exciting, right? Philosophy is both a body of knowledge, but also an activity. So at the moment, we're in a very active stage of thinking about normativity. So you do risk losing some clarity, but also it's kind of very exciting.
Professor, several essays seem to test normativity in specific, sometimes surprising context, such as aesthetic obligation or the ethics of agency. Why are these more applied or domain-specific cases so revealing for big, abstract questions about normativity?
Yeah, so I've tried to keep things light for everyone, but normativity can get, and philosophers' treatment of normativity can get very abstract. So it's a topic I haven't talked about is, which I think is really interesting, is there's an assumption that there's a clear, sharp divide between the normative and the non-normative, hence why we'd have those two labels. I'm not so convinced there's a really sharp divide there, but understanding that is going to get very abstract. Reasons talk can get very abstract. The arguments that people might offer for reasons being conceptually prior to oughts, so the smaller building blocks compared with the overall judgment, and the arguments people might give for oughts being in a certain form of oughts being fundamentally prior to reasons, they get very abstract and very complicated and very subtle, right? And so all of that abstract talk is kind of very interesting to a philosopher, perhaps not so interesting to other people. But when you kind of bring that to the level of everyday examples, which philosophers do, philosophers think about everyday hypothetical examples and everyday real life examples. Philosophers might have sometimes a tendency to be abstract, certainly will have a reputation for being abstract, but actually philosophers are very practically minded. They're always looking at the real world and think about all sorts of applications of their ideas or seeing their ideas just emerge and as evidence for what's going on. I mean, you mentioned I direct this centre called IDEA at the University of Leeds. I'm teaching engineering ethics and business ethics and medical ethics to students. We go out and we do consultancy for businesses as well. So we're quite practically minded. And so bringing all those abstract ideas into conversation with real life examples in the art world, for example, and the value that people have had, value that people have seen of paintings and the reasons one might give for creating a painting or destroying it is kind of really important. It reveals some of and is a good test for our abstract ideas about, for example, of value or of oughts. And so philosophers are doing this the whole time. It's a kind of typical methodology that we engage in. Because if you're just doing things abstractly, it's even hard for philosophers to follow. We like kind of nice examples. So you'll get quite a lot of that in the volume as well.
Professor, contemporary debates often focus on whether normative facts are natural, non-natural, or reducible to reasons, values, or something else. Did this collection shift your own view on the metaphysics of the normative or on how important that metaphysical question really is?
So did it shift my view? No, because I've got a well-entrenched view, a meta-ethical view, right? So, and I don't know if it would shift anyone else's. So, yes, I mean, even though I presented it quite neutrally earlier on, my own view in meta-ethics is that I'm a moral realist and I'm a non-naturalist. Even within that family, there's different views. So you might be, let's say, an out-and-out Platonist, where you think these are causally efficacious, big, kind of non-natural properties. I don't believe that. I prefer to think of them as definitely not natural, and they are more like colours that might emerge from humans' interaction with society through our biology. And nothing in this volume has shifted my view about normative and evaluative properties and that meta-ethical view. There isn't too much about that in this volume, but there's lots of other books on that. I mean, so I wrote a textbook on meta-ethics about 10 years ago. I think some people might shift their view on meta-ethics by reflecting on normative topics, because philosophers have interesting minds and they might shift, but I don't know what that shift would be. But certainly there's lots of people who will think about reasons in naturalistic ways and oughts in naturalistic ways and values as naturalistic ways, i.e. things that are real, but they are best understood or can be understood by scientists, neurophysiologists, psychologists, whatever, but not me.
Professor, the volume is explicitly future-oriented. If a graduate student came to you wanting to work on normativity, what are 2 or 3 very specific questions from this book that you would tell them are ripe for future work?
So, right for future work, I think authority, which I mentioned earlier, and also this idea of which normative concept is the most fundamental. And often this is, I don't know if I mentioned this earlier on, but often this is termed firster. So you could be a reasons firster or an oughts firster or a norms firster. And I think there's still quite a lot of life in that. And I think what's ripe is just to argue against it. And then I think the idea of just unpacking what it is for something to be normative and what it is for something to be non-normative, which I've mentioned in passing, just to dwell a little bit on that. I said earlier on when I was explaining this right at the start that there's a kind of mechanical use of the word ought or should. You know, I've looked at the forecast, it should rain later on. That's not an ethical should or an epistemic should. It's just an expectation. You know, it's the matter of probability and nothing more. But working out, it's actually, once you get into it, it's a little bit harder to work out the difference between these mechanical shoulds and normative shoulds. So working out and working through the details of that, I think, is something that would be right for consideration. Yeah.
Professor Simon, before we wrap up, one final question. Normativity is not just a technical topic, it shapes how we think about public life, science, and education. How might the ideas in the future of normativity matter for non-philosophers, for example, policymakers, scientists, or teachers?
So I think there's some of this stuff that won't matter at all, right? So the very abstract debates about the relationship between the concept of a reason and the concept of an ought is not really going to be something that will shift the dial in politics or business. But if I were someone involved in other academic disciplines like business studies or sociology, who do think regularly about normativity, and economics as well, they think a lot about the positive and the normative, then thinking about how philosophers have thought about it would be of interest, because there's often these 2 broad concepts, the positive, the normative, the descriptive, the normative, the positive and the evaluative might be deployed, but actually there's a lot going in, a lot to unpack, and that's where philosophers come in. And then if you are a politician or someone in business, there is something kind of every day where we think, okay, this is how the business is running, or this is how political life is going on, but what should we do, or what should we do about this particular issue, this particular potential policy or set of options? What should we do? And actually trying to just having some familiarity with the different ideas of reasons and oughts and shoulds and their different strengths and values and norms and standards. I always find that reflection on these, even though it might seem abstract, can actually deepen your way in which you might frame those first order debates about this is how things are, but wow, but what should we do? In a surprising way. It won't kind of, a philosophical idea or theory about reasons isn't going to tell you which road to build and where. I mean, that would be mad. But it will help you sometimes frame the issue better and lead to more cogent talk and more cogent debate often. So that's probably what someone in first order business or politics can learn. But certainly I would hope people in other academic disciplines can just realize there's an awful lot to unpack in normative talk, and that's what philosophers are doing.
Listeners, thank you for joining us and listening to this conversation. I hope today's discussion has opened up some fresh ways of thinking about normativity and why it matters beyond the seminar room. If you enjoyed this episode, do consider sharing it with a colleague or student who might find it useful. And feel free to send in your questions and reflections. Until next time, stay curious and keep thinking carefully about results, values, and obligations that shape our lives. Thank you again, Professor Simon Kirchin, for sharing your time and research publication with us today. This has been a truly enlightening episode. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me on, Deepak.